In this age of new normal, online is not your only option. Because new normal means new learning modalities and new learning possibilities. Let Vibal make learning offline possible with Smart Class. Smart Class contains pre-made daily modules sequenced according to DepEd's budgeted teaching and learning calendar. Each module has a specific lesson duration and has day markers to guide parents and teachers in the asynchronous learning of learners. Inside the modules available in Smart Class, you will find the following elements. First, learning competencies are identified in the module openers. Kickstarters are available to test students' prior knowledge on the subject matter. This set of activities, found at the beginning of each lesson, may also serve as motivational activities. Parents of preschool to grade 2 students will also find notes to parents which contain tips and pointers on how they can guide their child while learning at home. Redefine your students' learning experience with the integration of augmented reality technology into images and illustrations available in Smart Class, making learning more interactive and exciting. At the end of each module, Long Quiz is also available to assess students' understanding of the lesson. Smart Class also features Wrap Up, a lesson ender activity that applies the constructivism theory of learning. In Wrap Up, students are expected to summarize the lesson on their own using a graphic organizer. You may also evaluate the quality of your students' learning by letting them practice their learning in real life through GRASP's formatted performance tasks. The content of Smart Class is designed for the entire academic year, and it is available for 5 major subjects. All aligned with DepEd's K-12 curriculum and covers the most essential learning competencies prescribed by DepEd. Secure your own copy of Smart Class before classes open. Contact marketing@vibalgroup.com to know more.
Good day, Kavibal, and welcome to our Developing Diagnostic Instruments webinar series. For the discussion today, the topic will be on creating diagnostic assessment tools for listening capacity. Before we begin, take note of the following reminders. Make sure you are registered to the webinar to have your e-certificate of participation. Visit certificate.vibalgroup.com to generate your proof of attendance. Place your questions on the comment box allotted during the session and they will be addressed by our speaker later on. Share the video using hashtag LearnAs1PH as our official hashtag to our Vibal webinars. Experience learning, Kavibal. And now, to proceed with our webinar this afternoon, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our distinguished speaker today. John Michael de la Paz, or Teacher Mike to his students, graduated with a degree in elementary education, teaching in the early grades from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, magna cum laude. He then finished his MA in comparative literature, focusing on Philippine children's literature from the College of Art and Letters in the same university. As a former faculty of the UP College of Education, UPIS, he has taught at the kinder, elementary, secondary, undergraduate, and graduate levels. After deciding to leave and learn outside the university, he took the board licensure exam for teachers in March of 2018 and ranked first. For the past 9 years, he has been training teachers around the country with different organizations, most of which are projects with the Department of Education on reading and literacy, storytelling, gender equality education, and children's literature. Current, he is a teacher and assistant director of CHMCDC. Like most of you, he is still finishing his modules for his elementary students and is not trying not to panic. He loves chocolate chip cookies, spaghetti, and sports. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Mr. John Michael de la Paz.
Hi. Hello. Thank you so much for the introduction. Good afternoon to everybody watching in this YouTube video. I'm happy to be here again. This is my third with Vibal, and I'm thankful that they got me again. And hopefully, I can share with you ideas on our topic for today. So yan, magandang hapon. And yes, 5 linggo na kami nagtuturo sa online. So galing rin akong turo. So sa mga nagpe-prepare pa lang, I wish you all the best. And hopefully, the things you will learn from this topic or this talk will help you in the coming school year. So let me just pull out my slide. There you go. So again, good afternoon, everybody. Our topic for today is creating diagnostic assessment tools for listening capacity. Now, it sounds highfalutin, it sounds complicated. Well, it is in fact complicated. But in 1 hour, you really can't create a standardized test for listening capacity. So my focus is on informal criterion reference assessment for early grades to high school. And since I only have an hour, I shall be discussing key points on how you can create your own assessment. I just want to remind everybody, of course, that there are reading specialists, there are experts on learning abilities and learning disabilities and learning struggles and challenges. And for those children who are struggling with reading, we might need those experts, right? But that doesn't mean that as a classroom teacher and somebody teaching inside the classroom, inside the school, it doesn't mean that you cannot create your own assessment. In fact, you know exactly what's happening inside your classroom. So it is really you who's the best one to see or to notice the difficulties your children are experiencing, particularly in reading. For this afternoon, we shall be focusing on listening capacity. So I just want to start by introducing myself. Yeah. So nag-celebrate kami ng buwan ng wika recently and I did a storytelling. So that explains that picture. So my name is John Michael De La Paz, teacher Mike. That's what my students call me. I'm a reading and classroom teacher. So forget about all the things that you heard earlier. But what's most important is that I am a reading teacher and a classroom teacher. I'm not a reading specialist, okay? Meaning my topic is will be focusing on research, but also on my experiences as a teacher of reading and literacy. And as a classroom teacher, kayo rin nga, katulad ng sinabi ko, kaya nyo rin gumawa ng assessment at dapat kayong gumawa ng assessment specifically for listening capacity. So our topic this afternoon, I divided into 3 parts. I just want to review, understand, and diagnose. So for review, we shall be just going through some terms and concepts in literacy and assessment that is very important when we talk about the topic at hand. At the same time, we shall understand the relationship of reading and listening because a lot of teachers, maybe not everybody, but a lot, not just teachers, lalo na yung parents natin who are also helping out with the learning the school year, we tend to think that reading and listening are really similar and thus they just share the same skills and the same way of assessment. So we don't really think about that difference. And we want to flesh that out. What are the key differences? And what is the actual connection of reading and listening? And lastly, diagnose. This is where I will give you pointers or tips on how to create your informal criterion reference listening diagnostic assessment that will inform your practice as a teacher. So hopefully this afternoon, you'll get a lot from this topic. So there. So let's first review terms and concepts in literacy and assessment. So don't worry, wala naman tong quiz after, but it would be really nice to review some of these. So listening, when you talk about listening, it's basically the ability to understand what is heard. And like the other macro skills, it's also a process. So it starts with hearing sounds, and this starts at the very at the at the youngest early age possible where learners, not just learners, kids, before going to school, they know and they hear sounds and they're able to discriminate those sounds. Because if they can't, if they're having problems and difficulties with hearing sounds, then they won't be able to process what it is they are hearing. And when they process that, understanding hopefully ensues. So it's a process. Listening is a process. So when we talk about listening capacity, we're using listening capacity in the context of reading and teaching reading. If you take it literally, It simply says that it's how how you listen, right? Or your ability to listen. But for today, listening capacity is the capacity to understand through listening with reading taken out of the equation. So that's very important, as you'll find out in a bit. An example of this is read aloud. When somebody's listening to a read aloud, we take out the reading or the decoding part of it. So it's really focusing on that capacity of listening. Also, listening comprehension level is another term for listening capacity. Most of the time, this is quantitative, especially if you're using a standardized test. But for this afternoon, we will be looking at some quantities or numbers, but it's more of qualitative. Okay. But again, listening comprehension level or listening capacity can be both measured using quantitative and qualitative means. Also, listening capacity can be an indicator of the child's ability to comprehend oral language. So it's an indicator. So if you have a high listening capacity, then it means that you have that ability to comprehend oral language, which will connect to your reading expectancy. Now, later on, I'll be clarifying that reading and listening are separate skills. But if you have a high listening capacity, then it might help teachers and experts and specialists look at your reading expectancy, or meaning yung level mo of reading that's matched with your mental age or learner's ability age. Yeah. So meaning if you have your quantitative and qualitative nature of listening capacity, to get that, you need to have an assessment. And to further get that assessment, I mean, when you're done with the assessment, you'll have data. And that data is what's going to inform your teaching and your reading intervention if you need one. Okay. So I know, again, reading, I just want to reiterate, reading is a very technical field. Okay, like what I said earlier, there are specialists and experts. That's why, as teachers, as classroom teachers, we should be at least aware of the basics. So I will not be discussing in detail the nitty gritty or very technical terms on assessment, but I will be focusing, like as I previously said, on assessment that is criterion reference. Okay, but nonetheless, diagnostic assessment has this for us. First, it assesses specific skills or components. So it might be, your reading capacity, your comprehension, phonological awareness, such as in literacy, this might include phonemic awareness, phonic skills, listening comprehension, and reading comprehension, and a lot more. Okay. In diagnostic assessment, it will benefit all of your students, but it's particularly needed by struggling and at-risk readers, those you have identified or you have observed to have, you know, that struggle in reading. Okay, so your diagnostic assessment will give you a clearer picture of that struggle. The results should inform instruction and intervention. Walang kwenta ang diagnostic assessment kung hindi mo naman gagamitin yung datos na nakuha mo mula doon sa iyong pagtuturo o sa iyong practice. So, diagnostic assessment should inform your instruction and your intervention. Now, diagnostic assessment can come in two forms. It can be a norm referenced kind, or it can be your criterion referenced. I know most of us have graduated from edu schools, right? So we should already know this, but it's very important to review. So when we say norm reference, it's formal. It's always formal. It has to be compared to a defined population. And there are standard scores that are needed for it. It's typically administered once a year, and it can be quite expensive because most of this need a subscription or an individualized set of test materials. So it's a bit pricier. But there, I think, I'm not sure if any free norm yung formal na administered standardized test, but most of these are really expensive. So sample are the GORT or the Gray Oral Reading Test, and PAT2 or the Phonological Awareness Test 2. For criterion reference, take note that it can be both formal and informal. Okay, now, the thing with formal and informal in assessment, some teachers think that when it's informal, it's less, it's less serious or it's less credible. But in fact, informal assessment can still help you in your teaching, and it will help you if you know how to do it properly. Okay? So kaya lang siya sinasabi na formal and informal because formal has more detailed data, has more basis, has a stronger foundation on that test, right? But for informal, this includes things like, your quizzes are informal tests, informal criteria reference papers, right? Katulad na lang rin ng, when you have activities, those can also fall under informal. Does it mean it's not important just because it has the word informal to it? Okay, it just means it's not as highly standardized as your other tests. Okay, so when we focus on criterion reference, it means we're comparing the student skills to a defined set of skills or goals. So kanina kasi in norm reference, we're comparing them to a population. In criterion reference, our goal is to compare that to a defined set of skills or goals. So this can be informed by your curriculum, the standards your school has set or the Department of Education has set, such as competencies and whatnot. It can also be done multiple times in a year. So this is really more formative, right? Hindi katulad ng norm reference, you can't administer that more than once or at least more than twice because it can be very difficult and it's really taxing. So nakakapagod yan para sa mga estudyante. And again, part of that norm reference is the data processing of that will really include a lot of analysis. So pag criteria reference, it will be done multiple times in a year and pwede siyang gawin talaga in your classrooms or even at home. So examples, you can have your predisposed test and it also measures growth. And an example is the PhilErie, or the Philippine Informal Reading Inventory that the Department of Education has graciously developed for all the Filipino children. So you can look into that. Okay. So ito example ng Phonological Awareness Test 2. This is a standardized test. So sample ng mga itetest nila dyan, rhyming and discrimination and production, segmentation, sentences, syllables and phonemes, and isolation. So these are the ones I highlighted. Rhyming, segmentation, isolation, dapat na-identify nila what's the initial, final, and middle sound. You also have deletion, when you are able to manipulate root word syllables and phonemes. Substitution with manipulatives, blending, syllables and phonemes, phoneme graphing correspondence, phonemic decoding. Again, these are all detailed test questions as part of the phonological awareness test too. Now you know the standardized test, you can draw out some of the things that they are testing and create a simpler one because we can't always afford or we don't have easy access to standardized tests, right? So you can create your own. You just have to also look at that, at the things that we're studying. But of course, we're not going to pretend and assume that it's going to be standardized, okay? Because again, standardized test goes through a lot of process or through a long process for it to be standardized. So I'm just giving you an idea what a standardized test might be testing. So this is an example of a reading inventory from the scasd.org. It's in America. So it's also it's a criterion reference, but also it has a standard. So it's norm reference as well. So kino-compare yan sa Lexile mo. But Lexile is another topic that a reading specialist would be better to talk to you about it. Okay. So ang idea lang nito is if you look at the ones here on the right side, meron tayo. Sige, let me just annotate that for you. So this one, these are the kinds of text na binabasa nila. So it's a series of passages that they have to read. This is a reading comprehension assessment and not a listening comprehension. And then these are the Lexile score yan. So pataas yan ng pataas, pahirap ng pahirap. And also, the kinds of text differ. So meron diyang fiction, non-fiction, informative text, or even a process type of text again. And it gives you data. So in this case, the child's Lexile score is going up, which is supposed to be the case for each kid in our classrooms. Okay. So let me just end that one. Yeah. So going back. Now, like what I said, diagnostic assessment can take two forms here, norm reference or criterion reference. But for today, we shall be focusing on the criterion reference, particularly of informal assessment. So this can include closed procedures, story retellings, or running records, katulad ng mga anecdotes ninyo about their students' listening or reading capacity. And then you have your informal reading inventories or the EREs, right? So that's that. Sayang, this is just a webinar. I'm not talking to anyone in particular, but if you have questions for that, you can put it there in the chat box of YouTube. And I think our friends from Vibel will help me with that later on. Okay, so now that we have those terms reviewed, we can now go to understand the relationship of reading and listening. Now, why did I include this? Because a lot of people, they misconstrue reading and listening. Or they think that reading and listening are just very similar, and that if you can listen, then it means you also are reading. Uh, Actually, obviously, it's not, kasi nga, it has a different name. It also has a different way of assessing it, and also there are a lot of different things that are particular or specific to each one. So the five macro skills of language learning include those. So you have your listening, you have your viewing, you have your writing, you have your speaking, and of course you have your reading. And reading and listening are separate. Okay, they're separate skills in language learning. Now, if you want to look at it from the 14 domains of literacy uh, in our experts from the Department of Education, yeah. So we have your oral language. So I'm just telling you, showing you uh, where it falls under in the K to 12 continuum. So alphabet knowledge, and meron ka sa K to 3, phonics and word recognition, fluency, until 7 to 10 yan. Spelling, you have K to 3 until 4 to 6. I mean, when we say until 4 to 6, dapat dyan yung priority ng spelling. Writing and composition, it's until grade 12. Grammar, awareness and structure, obviously, it's still until grade 12. And then you have vocab development. Yeah, we talked about that in a previous verbal talk. And then you have reading comprehension. And lastly, you have your listening. Sorry, not last. Number 12 is listening comprehension, which, if you notice, it's only until 7 to 10. Attitude towards language, literacy, and literature. And lastly, study strategies, which goes until K to 12. Now, Teacher JM or Teacher Mike, bakit hanggang 7 to 10 lang? When we say hanggang 7 to 10 lang, yan yung priority na listening comprehension. Dapat by 7 to 10, their listening comprehension, their listening capacity is at that level that will enable them to participate in a grade 11 to 12 kind of discussion. So this includes not just skills, but also behavior. You know, how they are able to take down notes while listening to someone talking, and the like, or participating in a debate and an argument. So, kaya 7 to 10, dapat maayos na yan listening comprehension nila. Okay. So, I just started with this one because it just tells you that listening comprehension has a place in the domains of literacy and the macro skills of language. So, the question is listening and reading the same? So let's look at the connection of reading and listening. Listening comprehension and reading comprehension has a complex relationship. Diba? So parang katulad ng maraming relasyon dyan. Just kidding. Yan. So it can be complicated. You know, relationships are not really that easy. Just like reading and listening. Yes, may hugot tayo. Bakit ba? Ayan. For listening comprehension and reading comprehension, it's not as easy as you might think it is. So for online learning specifically, as a word of caution, we have to be careful when we focus too much on listening comprehension. For those teachers who are already teaching, we might be focusing too much on listening and reading and forgetting that listening and reading comprehension are very different. We tend to project or share screen to read, and it's not going to be enough, as students may not be that engaged. Thus, students still need to have something to read. So it's better to still have or still send them something that they can print out, or maybe an actual book that they can read together. Okay? Kasi ngayon online learning, we might abuse projecting or sharing screen and forget that reading comprehension and listening are very different. We can't just tell stories all the time. We have to give them an opportunity to really read an actual text. Okay? So, I decided to discuss this quick study by Shahanan, actually a write-up on it. And he is asking the question, does listening deficit predict a reading deficit? Meaning, if you're lagging or medyo behind ka sa iyong listening comprehension, ma-affect ba nito yung reading deficit mo or yung reading capacity mo as well? So, here's some notes that you have to understand. Young children can understand more through listening than reading. Why? Two things. First, decoding can be a problem. If you don't know how to decode yet, meaning you're not very well adept or experienced with the relationship of sounds and printed word. Okay, so yung phonics mo, for example, magkaka-problem ka talaga, right? And also prosody. Prosody is the cues, okay, that oral language gives us. In listening, the reader provides the rhythm, the sound, and intonation for students. Diba? So, kunyari, pag nag-ask, when you're listening to a story, the reader or the storyteller, the teacher, would be giving you that intonation. So, at dahan-dahan, naglakad ang mga bata papunta sa dilim. So, in that way, kahit na hindi mo binabasa, di ba? You are already adding, the storyteller or the teacher is already giving cues on what's going to happen, right? Or what kind of text we're reading or what's happening in that particular event. Okay, so the rhythm and the pauses, if there's a period, the storyteller would have to pause. Diba? If there's a, if there's a comma, then there's a shorter pause. So lahat yan, yung reader na ang nagpo-provide. Okay? So in reading kasi, it doesn't happen that way. In reading, students have to figure out the cues in text. That's why when you're asking somebody to read, a student, specifically a younger kid, or a younger student, or a younger learner, if they're not yet well aware of periods and commas and your punctuation marks and your pauses in reading, they tend to just read and read and read. So for example, pag binasa nila tong nasa screen ko, young children can understand more through listening than reading. Decoding can be a problem. Prosody helps in listening. So you'd know that that reader doesn't yet know the pauses, okay, or the cues and the parts of that text that they have to stop and hold for a bit. Okay. Kaya kapag listening yung, so that's why young children can understand more through listening because they don't need to think about the rhythm, the sound, and the intonation. So nakafocus na sila sa pag-receive ng language, right? For older kids, however, this is wrong. That must be step in. Silent reading must step in. Okay. By grade 4, 5, and 6 until high school, kailangan marunong na sila magbasa silently. They don't need to always say it aloud. Okay, actually, silent reading is one of the factors that helps predict if that kid or that young learner will excel in his reading or will have a higher level of reading capacity. Kasi ang tendency is when we keep lalo na we're talking about high school when we keep asking them to read it, ang nangyayari, the mind or the brain of the learner, especially high school kids, they tend to always listen to what they're saying. So ang nangyayari, bumabagal sila magbasa. Okay, sa silent reading, kasi dapat nakakat na nila yung connection ng sound dun sa pagbasa nila sa mind. Because our eyes can see around 4 to 5 words at a time. Right? So yan yung dapat nyong maturo rin sa mga bata, especially in high school. Pero when we are so used to reading it out loud, ang tendency, kahit na silent reading ka na, in your mind, you're still imagining the sounds or how the word is pronounced. So bumabagal lalo yung reading. Okay. So again, silent reading must step in. And especially if that child was able to develop his reading capacity or her reading capacity, oral reading becomes easier than listening. Di ba kaya yung matatanda, minsan lalo pag nagbabasa ka nga, mas gusto mo na minsan na may binabasa ka. I don't know, just to be general about it, whatever religion you are in, for instance, if you're attending any kind of service, most people would want something to read, or even in a concert or a program, diba? You want something projected for you to read it, because when you listen, sometimes your mind wanders and then you lost the train of thought of the speaker. So for older readers, sometimes most of the time, it's easier to do silent reading or oral reading than listening. Okay. Now, so listening is easier until a reader can interpret prosody himself, or can decode with ease. So until masanay na nga yung bata na yun in getting these cues from the text without having someone read it to him or to her, then listening will still be easier. But after that, reading takes over. So more literate adults understand complex texts better by reading than by listening. Well, that's the idea, sana. And thus, in conclusion, using listening as a way of determining how well younger students or lower readers might be able to read is reasonable, but not so with older adults. Yes, listening can determine how well a younger student or a lower reader might comprehend reading texts. But for older students, hindi na yun sakto. Now, to further see those differences, I also pulled up this study by Brown in 2011, Listening Myths Applying Second Language Research to Classroom Teaching. So we're focusing on second language learners, not Native American or English speakers. So they noticed. So Brown made this table listing a lot of studies. So ano bang difference ng reading and listening? Readers recall more ideas overall, but listeners remember more ideas or more details. Listeners recall more ideas or do better at main idea questions, while readers recall more details or did better at detailed questions. Yeah, iba-iba yan. Si Lon and Park yan. Listeners display deeper learning and more motivation. Listening and reading share comprehension processes but different in decoding. So that's very obvious. So yes, makikita nyo mamaya, meron pa rin getting the main idea, inferencing, na ginagawa mo both in reading and in listening. But for decoding, of course, that's very different. Thus, listening comprehension is not equal your reading comprehension. Okay? It's not totally equal. Yes, they can influence each other, especially at the younger or the beginning readers or the earlier stages in our learning of literacy, but it's not equal. Having put that all aside, so okay na, na-review na natin yung terms, we were already also able to see the difference of listening and reading. We can now look into how we can diagnose listening comprehension. Okay, now, creating a listening diagnostic assessment. A listening test usually looks like a silent reading comprehension test. Nung bata ako, well, in my school, no, in my grade school, so that was 1990s. I mean, I'm 31 now, so 1996 to 2001 ako na grade 1. And I would panic a bit kapag quarterly exams na pag silent reading kasi, pag listening test na. Pag quarterly exams, pupunta na yung Filipino teacher mo or yung English teacher mo. Magka-classroom to classroom yan. So, depende kung anong class yung mauuna. And then that teacher will read the passage. Usually once or twice lang siya babasahin. And then you have to also answer the questions on your test paper na wala ka ng kopya ng story. Diba? Kasi it's a listening test. So even if it's really relatively shorter, that's how it looks like. It's similar to a reading comprehension test, but you're not reading anything. So you're removing the decoding part. Unless you're in grades 4, 5, 6, yung sasagutan mo, it already has something to read, like yung options, you have your multiple choice type questions, right? But for younger learners, a listening test can just involve, circling, underlining, coloring, but like what I said, listening test usually looks like a silent reading comprehension test. So there's a series of graded text passages and then questions after about the text follow. Now, the teacher reads the material to the student, and the student simply listens. Decoding problems can't disrupt comprehension, and that's why later on, or as you might have already noticed, a lot of students might have an easy time listening, but might have a harder time reading. So kapag nagso-storytelling ka nga, nakaka-participate sa conversations, it means there's that listening capacity. But when you leave that child alone or that learner alone with the text, and she or he might have problems, then makikita mo that there's a disconnect. Okay, the listening capacity and the reading capacity are not at par or not at the same level. Now, a listening diagnostic assessment isn't just a series of graded text passages and then questions after about the text. It can also involve tasks, even drawings, or informal writing. Okay. So there. So if you're asking what needs to be on a listening skills diagnostic, first, you need to have a list. So you have to list listening skills students should be proficient in at a certain level. So because for this afternoon we are tasked to, the topic is giving you that task to create your own diagnostic. Then you have to know what you want to diagnose. This means if you're with the Department of Education, you should look at your curriculum. And they also look at the milks, for instance. Check there kung nasan dun yung mga skills, particularly those that have something to do with listening. So you can check your school curriculum, or you can also look at competencies. So what is it that you really want to diagnose? Hindi yun pwedeng kukuha ka lang, nakakita ka ng listening skills diagnostic online, tapos dinownload mo, ginamit mo, without even looking kung tinetest ba niya yung kailangan ng bata at that level. Okay? Now, aside from that expected competencies that your curriculum or your guide is asking you to make sure your students learn. Number two, you also have to include skills that will be taught in the class. So remember that anything that you will teach in the class, may it be in listening or beyond listening, you should know what they can do or where they are at and how much needs to be taught. Okay? Dito kasi nakakalimutan ng mga teachers or natin sometimes yung importance ng assessment. Yes, technically lang. I'm not saying it's the right way to do it. Technically, yes. Pwede hindi ka nag-diagnose sa simula, tapos learning still happens kasi nagturo ka buong taon. Okay? But that's not a good pedagogical or, that's not good pedagogy. It's not a good educational practice because you need to know and you need to be able to measure kung saan sila nanggaling at saan sila nakarating after a school year. Particularly in our topic today, listening skills. So it's a diagnostic. You should be able to see, okay, where they are at before you started the instruction and where you want them to bring. Okay, so that's why that's very important. Now, there are many categories of listening skills, and this is one from Reading Rockets. Categories of listening skills to test. So it might involve oral vocabulary. So this involves morphology, meaning parts of the word, understanding meaningful word parts such as prefixes and suffixes or common roots. So dapat they're familiar with that. So if you remember or if you do reading or storytelling or read alouds in your classroom, even if you're in high school, but usually you unlock words first. And in a classroom setup, even if you're going to do it online, most of the time when you unlock vocabulary, you don't do it as a worksheet. Most of the time, it's a whole group discussion. Diba? So, anong nangyayari, yung pag-unlock natin ng words, it becomes a listening activity of sorts. Okay, so yun. So, pwede mo silang masanay while doing that. Okay? Sometimes, you can give a sentence and they can use the context clues within that sentence without having to read anything. And then you can ask them to define a word, right, or a part of that sentence or a word that is in that sentence. Okay. Now you can also check your background knowledge. Okay, background knowledge meaning what do they already know? In schema theory, diba, we want to connect ideas. For learning to occur, it's effective that it will be connected to something that your students already know. So in listening skills, it can also tell you what a test on listening skills can also tell you what they already know. Okay. Now, sentence and or particularly the syntactic comprehension, dito na pumapasok yung how they understand sentences, right? So it's very important that they know that there's a subject and a predicate, right? And what do these things do? That, there's a verb in a sentence, there's a describing word in it, there's a naming word to it. So they would have to understand what that means. Okay? And syempre, yung pragmatic use of language, meaning how you use it in social context. Diba? May mga subtle aspects of language usage, such as sarcasm. So in listening skills, you should check. You can also check if your students can get that. Is this sarcastic? What's the tone? What's the emotion of the one reading it? So in listening comprehension, pwede nilang makuha yun. And in fact, it can be easier because if you're reading it and reading comprehension, for example, you want, to see if you're focusing on the tone. But if it's a sad, if it's a sad story or it's an exciting paced story, mahirap yun makuha pag hindi kaya ng bata yung reading comprehension. He doesn't know the cues to it. He doesn't understand the text itself. It's harder because he or she has to figure that out. But in listening comprehension, if the reader or the teacher is already supplying that or providing those subtle aspects of language, then you can still test that. Okay? Kasi makikita nila if the student knows how to detect emotions in reading, in something that's being read or said or uttered. Okay? You can also include their idioms, idiomatic expressions, right? So in listening, pag narinig nila tong idiom na ito, they get it. Like it's raining cats and dogs, or certain expressions that happen, right? Or sorry, that occur in a conversation. Then you can test that if they get those things. Now, a more competency-based or skills-specific to listening test would look something like this. So these are some things that you can test, right? So meron kang, ay, lumabas na pala yan. Sorry. Recognizing the literal meaning, understanding vocabulary, making inferences, identifying main ideas, summarizing content, determining the point of view. You have analyzing, reasoning. You're analyzing how reasoning is occurring in that listening test, and then finding evidence. If you notice, these are all similar to what you have in reading comprehension, diba? You note details. You need to answer questions, the five W's and an H, right? You also have to understand vocabulary. So kapag nagtetest ka in Filipino and in English, take note again, this is for both languages, okay? So this is not just English. Di ba, pag nagpapatest ka sa reading comprehension, meron dong, I don't know if you still do it, pero ang most common that language teachers use in pen and paper test is you have a multiple choice question, you have a sentence, and then, kunyari in Filipino, ano ang kahulugan ng salitang may salungguhit? Basahin ang pangusap at piliin ang sagot. So, pipiliin nila kung ano yung synonym. Most of the time, synonym yung ginagamit, di ba? So they can still happen in listening. So wala lang silang babasahin, but you can still make them understand what vocabulary is. Meaning, even if you haven't really, even if you didn't explicitly teach it in the context of listening, yung mga prefixes and suffixes, if you were able to teach that in your language classes, then they can apply that to their listening, and you can test that. Kung nakukuha ba nila, how do they attack a word when they don't understand? For example, you said in that sentence, you said the word replay, and because they know that re means again, then they would figure out in their brains or in their minds, even without reading it, that replay meaning I will play again. So replay means to play again. Right? So yes, it's not just in reading comprehension. It also happens in listening comprehension, especially making inferences. Diba? This is reading between the lines, what the author is not telling you. So remember, in making inferences, what you want to do is to teach the child that you have to use what's in the text plus what you know. So what you know means it's based on your experiences, your prior knowledge, your interaction with your classmates, what you see on computers or online or reading, or even things that you've already read. So what you know, what the book is saying or what the text is all about, and what you know, you combine them together, then you can make an inference. Kasi nga, hindi yan, inferences are not explicitly said or told in a reading text. So in our case, in listening, they have to know how to make that inference. What they know, what the text is saying, and then you make an inferences. So pwedeng emotions nga, feelings, emotions, or ideas even. And then as you notice, again, identifying main idea also happens both in reading comprehension and listening comprehension. So you read the text, short text even, and then you identify the main, you ask them to identify the main idea. This can come in different forms. Sometimes you can ask for a different title, di ba? Yung lumalabas minsan sa test. What could be another title for this text? So it helps you identify the main idea. Another one is, what is the story all about? Yeah, that's my choices sila doon. Yeah. And then you have summarizing content. Especially for older learners, ito yung pwede yung pagawa. You can ask them to summarize them. But minsan kasi what we have to avoid is yung wala man lang scaffolding, wala man lang tayo ina-expect what kind of summary is expected of them. Usually just get the papers and summarize. Especially for the middle grades and lower grades, you have to give them a sense of structure. Okay, what do they need to summarize? Ang stress kasi dyan for kids is there's so many things that happen in the story or in the text that they might have a problem noting what are the important ones. So dapat you can provide some sort of structure. For example, just ask them to focus on one event, diba? Or maybe you can ask them to focus on the ending part, right? Or maybe you can just ask them to focus on 4 events that happen in the story. Okay, so even if you're in high school, you're teaching high school, just give them a sense of structure. Okay, yes, siguro if you want to test it na, sila na bahala mag-summarize. Just make sure na na-equip mo na sila. You were able to equip them with what to include in a summary. Because summarizing is very important, but it can be lazy and haphazard if you don't teach children explicitly what to include in a summary. So dapat sanay na sila, bago mo sila get a piece of paper and summarize the story. Okay, dapat you already provided something, particularly a structure on how to summarize. But yes, being able to summarize something that they listen to will tell you how much they know. Okay, so summarizing doesn't always have to be a narrative or no, in prose or in paragraph forms. You can also try a concept map, di ba? Sa simula, concept mapping, di ba? You can test what they know. Yung concept map nila parang konting bilog lang. And then after the year, because you talked about the topic, or you discuss a lot of different things in reading class, then you give that same test. Pagdating mo ng fourth quarter or ng second term or ng third trimester, mapapansin mo yung concept maps nila mas nag-develop na. Okay. So it's already literally summarizing it, but you can see the development, how they summarize a certain text. Okay? So pag mas elaborate yan, mas explicit, mas elaborate and mas there are more details to it, then you know that their listening skill they have a higher listening capacity. Now, determining point of view, this is also very important. Your first person, second person, third person, who's the narrator, who is telling the story. Your students should be able to differentiate the author's voice from a character's voice. Yung mga ganyan, lalo na in the upper grades. Okay? And then analyzing reasoning and finding evidence, it's connected to each other. Listening, di ba? Listening involves listening to details and events and what happened in the story. Then you can also ask questions that involves reasoning. Why did this character do this? Okay? Find evidence to support your claim. Okay? So, yun yung mga ideas kasi na kulang medyo sa mga estudyante natin, especially in the Philippines, because we tend to focus too much on recognizing literal meaning or noting details. And then we forget about analyzing and reasoning. Remember, when we want our children to learn how to create ideas or to even argue a stand or a point. But for them to be able to argue, they need evidence that is also based on on the text that they listen to. Right? For example, if you ask them a question such as, do you think the character did a good do you think the character made the right decision? For example, may dilemma sila doon. Then if the kid has a high listening capacity, then you will be able to analyze that question and reason out and also find evidence to support that claim or his answer or her answer. Okay. Yeah. So again, we're just going through specific listening skills to test, but you can also use this one. Ito mas broad, diba? There are categories to it. Now, the Department of Education, if you look at the curriculum and your particular schools, you already have these competencies. So you just have to check what particular listening skills do you want to test. Now, how do you make an effective listening diagnostic according to Levy? Let's just make it simple. You just have to make it thorough and keep it simple, especially if you're making a diagnostic that's informal and something that you can use for your specific students. Okay, make it thorough and keep it simple. Why? We don't want to complicate things and then lose sight of what we want to measure. Remember, in assessment, that's why I started with that skills. You have to know what it is you want to measure. You just can't get a test and then, you just can't get a test and then make the students answer it. Okay, so you have to make it thorough and keep it simple. Let's go to make it thorough. How do you make it thorough? You want to consider skills to be assessed in the student level. Okay. Again, like what I said, know the skills that that needs assessment in the student level. You can assess a skill that is expected of a higher grade from a lower grade. So you can assess the listening skills of a grade 2, expecting na meron na siyang listening skills ng isang grade 6. Diba? So you should know the student level. Make sure that the text that you're going to use is age appropriate, or it's a leveled text. Level text meaning it's appropriate to their expected level. So parang sa reading comprehension. Okay, so you just can't get a text somewhere tapos hindi mo pa alam yung level na yun. Or kaya pwede mong nakuha mo siya sa website for teachers tapos nakalagay doon grade 3. Pero yung grade 3 text na yun sa American context pala, then baka hindi yun yung appropriate na text para doon sa iyong estudyante. That's why it's very important to contextualize. Another main point, okay, in the study of my professor, so Professor Dina Ocampo, she also find out in her studies that you cannot just apply ideas or studies on reading and listening that is considering a monolingual student. Okay, kasi for example, kapag based sa US, most of them, not all, but most of them are not really bilingual. Okay. So you have to consider those things when you're making an assessment that your students are mostly bilingual. Okay, meron na minsan nga multilingual pa nga, di ba? You have your mother tongue, you have your Filipino, and then you have your English. Okay. So understand an age, you have to help them understand an age-appropriate text type or genre. Okay? Yung genre and text type important rin yan. Kasi iba yung atake mo if you're reading fiction, and iba yung atake mo if it's a process-based, it's an informational text. Or even if it's a process text nga, like steps, di ba? Iba yan. Iba yung, and even if it's poetry, lalo na if it's poetry, you have your metonymy and your metaphors. So hindi yan pare-pareho ng approach. So even the text type will be very important when you're trying to create a diagnostic test. Okay. Let me just pull out my notes for that. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Then also you want to test, right, yung how they comprehend common questions and their appropriate responses. Like what I said earlier. Sorry, let me just get my notes for that. Ayan. So again, we ask questions, 5Ws and 1Hs, diba, and their appropriate responses to that. It's similar to your reading comprehension. It can also happen in your diagnostic test for listening comprehension. Okay. You also want to note directions and instructions. Can they follow instructions? Can they follow directions? In the earlier grades, it's one of the parts of the assessment of a child, especially if that child is applying for school or entering a school, diba? Gaano na kataas yung listening capacity niya, particularly in following directions and instructions. Okay. Yeah. What else did I forget? Yeah. And then you also have to understand unfamiliar vocabulary using context. Like what I said earlier, context clues is also a big part of listening comprehension. And then to take basic notes on an academic lecture. Ito rin, importante ito, lalo na for the middle grades to high school. Before you go to college, they have to make sure that part of their listening skill is they know how to take basic notes. And that's already, parang summarizing nga rin yun minsan, diba? Okay, noting the most important details or the main idea, supporting details, and so it's listening skills or listening diagnostic doesn't just involve skills like inferencing and getting the main idea. It also involves behavior, okay, in terms of taking basic notes and the like. Okay. Now you may also test students' ability to answer common personal questions and follow basic instructions. Okay, kaya nga di ba usually mga tanong sa simula, di ba, how are you? Like personal questions like what's your name? Diba? Where do you live? Those things, if you do it orally, then it can also be an assessment for listening. Now, more advanced level students should be able to understand unfamiliar academic vocabulary in context and take notes in a simple college lecture. Meaning, sometimes they can listen, diba? Dapat mabilis na yung pagkuha nila ng meanings or ng gist ng isang idea before they reach college. So habang nagno-note sila, they're processing the new information but they already know how to synthesize that into a note, in a sense of note-taking. Okay? Now, in addition to that, I just wanted to read part of my notes. Yeah. So you want to also be able to gather on data performance, you want to target specific areas of need, and then you have to provide personal instruction and targeted practice. That's why it's very thorough. Okay? So hindi siya pwedeng nanghula ka lang, kumuha ka lang online, na hindi mo naman inisip or you didn't really cross-reference it to the expected competencies or to your curriculum. Okay. So this is a sample of listening skills and behavior to be assessed for younger learners. For example, when I listen, I look at the reader. So pwedeng ang assessment po na dyan, very basic. Pwedeng checklist, di ba? You can make a rubrics if you want. When I listen, I do not talk. When I listen, I visualize what is being said. How do you test that one? You can there are a lot of strategies. Sketch to stretch, diba? Yung you draw after a story is being read to you, diba? Marami yan, I'll talk about that later. Then when I listen, I ask questions when I don't understand, right? So how do you assess this, diba? You can also, we don't want to focus so much on the frequency, but asking questions when I don't understand Diba? You can ask them through oral lang. Diba? Is there anything that you want to ask after the story? Or katulad din yung mga prediction parts, diba? Ng, kunyari, you have the KWL chart, for example. That's an activity that somehow assesses it. Pero syempre, hindi pa yun yung diagnostic that we're talking about. I'm just giving you an idea on how you can do it. You can also say, when I listen, I evaluate the book if I like it or not and give supporting ideas why. Yun nga, I like this example because when they're listening to a story, they find it boring. You can't reprimand them for speaking their minds. You just have to tell them how to support that. What makes it boring? Okay, hindi pwedeng boring siya, pangit siya, tapos wala lang. Okay, you have to make them, you can test, matatest mo yung listening skill nila. What makes it boring? What makes it exciting? Or what makes it nice? What makes it bad? Or what makes it good story? Makes it not a good story. So when I listen, I follow directions. Mga ganyan. Siyempre, for the older learners or for more experienced readers, you can create your categories. Ano ba yung mga gusto mong i-test? So oral vocabulary, you want your context clues and word analysis, your morphology. For sentence comprehension, you can talk about identifying main idea, making inferences, summarizing content. For background, you want to test if they can connect it to a previous schema, to a schema or building on previous knowledge. And for pragmatic language, you can decipher idioms, recognize tone, determining point of view, creating an argument with supporting ideas from the text. So again, this is just an example. So, but if you can see, I'm already starting to create my own. Kunyari, ito yung ginagamit ko. With what we've discussed already, I'm creating a list of what I want to assess, right? So let's keep it thorough, make it thorough. The next one is keep it simple. If you want to make a diagnostic assessment, you cover a number of skills needed in school and outside. So hindi pwede yung nasa, it's not advisable na ang tinitest mo lang, yung nasa competencies mo lang. Something, you should also be able to test something that they can use outside the school, like listening to conversations, listening to an argument and checking what are the flaws of that argument, for example. So hindi lang siya pwedeng puro school-based at yung performance na gusto mong magawa nila. They should be able to use it outside. So this is just something that I got from Levy. A maximum would be 3 to 4 pages, especially for older learners. Pero this is already maximum. Kasi listening will also involve your attention span, right? So if it's super long, then the reliability of your test might be problematic already or might be questionable. Kasi baka na-bore na kahit na meron naman palang listening capacity, it's super long, then it might not work. And then you also want to test more than one skill at a time. Okay, so meaning, if you want to test multiple skills, like yung kanina sinabi ko, then you can have just one text to read, and then the questions after will already hit vocabulary, inferencing, main idea. So you want to test more than one skill at a time. Okay, let me just check Okay, what else did I forget? Now that you already have an idea of what to do, then you have to also decide what kind of data you want to collect. Okay? So alam niyo naman na to kasi it's really basic. When you create a test or an assessment, you should have a table of specification. Diba? Ano dito yung so you already have a list of competencies that relates to listening comprehension or listening capacity. Now you want to put it in an assessment form. Ilang items yung para sa skill na to? Or baka isang item lang for each skill because it's a very informal one and just want to get an idea of where they are. Pwede rin mag-include ka ng weighted scores. Maybe you're going to give 2 points for this harder skill or for different levels of skills, right? O kaya same skill pero harder yung question that's still oral, that's still listened to, then you might give that a weight. Then rubrics are also very important. So rubrics na yan, there are a lot of kind of rubrics, but you can also try the 1-point rubric. You just set a middle part. So yun lang yung skill na gusto mo makuha nila. So if they go beyond that, it means they go to the right side. If they don't meet that, then they go to the left side. So you don't have to, again, may iba-ibang rubrics. 1 bullet point lang yung rubrics na I think is one of the effective one if you're creating a diagnostic. So it's either, kaya siya 1 point kasi you just specify the skill that they have to have. And then kapag beyond that, they go to the right side kasi it's a higher level, and if they miss that one, the one that you set, hindi nila abot yun, then they go below. Okay? Ang problema kasi sa rubrics sometimes, aminin man natin o hindi, because we want to differentiate all the levels. Ang nangyayari, minsan hindi mo na ma-differentiate yung difference ng one level to another. So you have to be very deliberate or intentional about that. Hindi yung para lang mag-iba-iba yung 1 to 5 mo na rubrics, for example. Okay. Now, creating portfolios, lalo na ngayong online, this is very important as well. Ang problema kasi sana for portfolios, you should have the portfolio of last year and then you can compare it to the portfolio of this coming year. So then you have an assessment. Diba? Kumbaga na-assess mo na sila prior to this level and see how it developed. But again, you have to be intentional about it. So dapat kung alam mo na ganun yung ginagawa niyo sa school niyo, you should know how to handle your portfolios. Hindi siya basta-basta pinagsama-sama lang. There's also a standard to that kung anong mga chine-check mo dun sa portfolio. And then after that, you also have to have an item analysis of the assessment given. You have to know, you have to check patterns, you have to look at things. I'll talk that in a bit, about that in a bit. So if you already decided the form of data to be collected, now you can create your own diagnostic, diba? For example, I'm just making it very simple. It can be more complicated than this. For example, for younger learners, you want following directions. It's written. Kung gusto mong i-assess vocabulary, basic shapes, primary colors, even simple prepositions. Sentence comprehension, you want to follow a sequence of instruction. So this is your instructions. These are your instructions. Draw a circle in the middle of the paper, color the square red. Sorry, draw a square in the middle of the paper, color the square red. Draw a triangle beside the square, color the triangle blue. Then I underline this because if you notice, this is two instructions that's put into one. So it's a higher, kumbaga, it's a more complicated way of listening to it. Draw a yellow circle on top of the red square. So yung data mo, what do you do with that data? Pag meron na siya nasagutan, you prepare a checklist or rubric. Or you can assign scores for each number. So kunyari, 1 point lang yung 1, 2, 3, 4, then 2 points yung 5. Or maybe you can give more weight to the given item. You can even do just a checklist like what I said. But so in that way, you already have an idea of where they are at in terms of following directions sa listening comprehension. So you're already creating this is already a diagnostic tool. Okay, but again, this is just an example because we don't have that much time to discuss the nitty-gritty of creating one. Example 2, what if you want a visual response? Diba? And I told you earlier, most of us, we ask students to draw after. Now, you just have to make that very deliberate, again, deliberate and intentional. Hindi pwedeng after story, nakinig sila sa story, drawing. Hindi ganun yun. You want to assess something, that's why you're asking them to draw. It's not just for a fun activity. Yes, it's fun. Drawing is fun. But we have to make sure that there's a purpose to that. And in assessment, that's very important. So for kunyari, visual response yung gusto mo, you want to assess noting details, noting important events, and sequencing events. Instructions, read a story. Give the student a paper with 4 numbered panels. Ask the student to draw 4 events that happen in the story in sequence. So lahat to oral lang. So what you can do, you can prepare a rubric again. You can focus on how elaborate details are. So the more details there are, the more sophisticated or higher the listening capacity is. And then you can also check the sequence. Kasi that's what you want to assess. So an example niyan, give them a paper. We can ask them to fold them into 4. Listening na rin yun, following instructions, fold it into 2 times. And then ask them to number it 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the more details they put into this tool that you have, then mas marami silang napakinggan or details na naalala, di ba? And then if you do the same activity again at the end of the school year or even at the end of the quarter, then you would know how accurate they are, or how more aware they are, or how more detailed they have become. So you're already seeing a baseline. Diba? This is what they did on the first day. Let's try it again after a month or after a quarter. Did it improve? That's what your assessment tools will look like. So syempre pinaka-basic is, yun nga, madalas ginagamit natin a text or a passage. For example, I want to assess noting details, getting the main idea, making inferences, unlocking word meanings through context clues. So maybe the basic instructions are read a short text or pwedeng a series of texts appropriate to the age level of the student, then ask students to answer multiple type questions post-listening or after listening. So beforehand, dapat na prepare mo na yung TOS mo or your table of specs. Your table of specifications will tell you what kind of questions you want to ask and what if these questions are actually measuring or assessing the competencies you want to check. Then of course you would want to do an item analysis. Okay, saan nagkakamali madalas yung mga estudyante? Why is this item problematic? Is it because of the quality of the item or the way it was phrased? Or it really is, kung napag-isipan mo mabuti yung tanong na yun, then maybe this is really a skill that most of them are having difficulty. Then you will check it, that will inform your teaching. So magfo-focus ka dito. Then also, you want to check in note scores. So sample lang yan. For example, kunyari, syempre hindi nyo papakita yan, di ba? Kasi it's a listening activity. I just created this. Many drink coffee every day, from iced lattes to shots of espresso. People all over the world love coffee, yet most do not know that there are four main types of coffee beans. These types are Arabica, Robusta, Liberica, and Excelsa. Arabica accounts for 60% of the world's coffee. Robusta comes second to Arabica as the world's most produced coffee. Liberica beans are larger than the others. At one point in the past, the Philippines was the #1 producer of Liberica coffee beans. Excelsa is the least produced. So if you notice, yung process ko, di ba, ako na yung nagpo-provide nun. So dapat rin pag nagtatest ka ng iba-ibang students or iba-ibang classes of students, your reading is also, it must be consistent. Kaya for listening diagnostic, it's better to record your reading para pare-pareho lang yung pinapakinggan ng mga tinetest nyo. So sample questions, noting details, how many main types of coffee are there? Inferential, is Philippines the #1 producer of coffee beans in the world today? Yes or no? So infer nila, hindi naman sinabi yung today, di ba? Yung past lang. Mean idea, what is another title for the passage? You can provide them some options. So it becomes a multiple choice type question. And then, ito pwedeng short answer. Vocabulary. Iced latte and espresso are kinds of what? So if they know how to use context clues, then they would figure out that there are kinds of forms of coffee. Okay? So yeah. So I'm just giving you samples of what a listening diagnostic tool can look like for you. Now, what do you do with data? Ito yung nakakalimutan na natin. Yes, nakapag-assess ka na. Yes, nagawa mo yung assessment mo ng maayos. But what do you do with that data? First, you want to look for general patterns. You want to connect the patterns to points of instruction. Okay, I spent this much time in teaching inferencing or teaching getting the main idea. Did it reflect on the test and listening comprehension? You also want to connect the points of instruction to the syllabus in the course objective. And, you also would want to focus on global or important issues first. Meaning, you want to be able to use texts that are timely. Okay? Kasi kapag matagal na yan and it's really out of their context already, magiging problem mo yung background. Remember, background is part of what you want to test in listening comprehension. So pag hindi nag-connect yung background nila, what they know about it, then your assessment, your diagnostic will become problematic. Okay? So yeah, so don't forget to use that data to inform your knowledge. Now, just to end, sakto 3 o'clock, these are just the key takeaways I want you to bring home if you did listen to this talk. So number 1, I want you to remember that students need both types of abilities to read and to comprehend well, listening and reading. Just one will not do. Okay? For example, may mga children who have excellent language comprehension with the ability to understand sophisticated stories, but they will still have difficulty in reading individual words. So yes, pwede silang okay sa comprehension sa listening comps, but pag nagpunta ka na sa word recognition, for example, or talagang word attack, then they can't read it. Diba? So hindi pwedeng isa lang. You can't focus too much on listening while forgetting reading. Again, don't forget the text genre or the types and the format of the test matters. Okay, so that's very important. Kunyari, listening comprehension ngayon, pero yung test questions mo naman, ang hirap basahin kasi nilagay mo doon. So it's also hard. It has something that's problematic. So you want to check that. Again, kasi yung text genre and type, other text genres can be harder for younger kids. Lalo na, for example, you're going to use poetry for listening comps. Tapos hindi pa naman sila sanay sa figurative language. Then that's going to be difficult. Bilingualism is an important factor. You cannot take this one out. Hindi tayo pwedeng kumopya ng kumopya sa America or sa US. Kasi nga, bilingual tayo. So, part ng pakikinig nila is connecting what they know in their mother tongue or even in Filipino. Number 4, listening comprehension must be done in Filipino and English. Okay? It's not just in English. Informal criteria reference diagnostic assessment will inform and help our teaching. And lastly, for severe weaknesses in either word recognition or oral language comprehension, This might require assessments conducted by special educators or reading specialists or psychologists. So yes, hindi sila readily available, but if you can, we can't always provide this for our students. Kailangan na minsan ng specialist, then don't be afraid, and there's nothing wrong with asking for help. Because it's better kapag reading specialist na talaga yung tumulong sa ating mga estudyante. Okay? So just a reminder that, a child who reads words accurately and automatically but who does not have good oral comprehension will not have a good reading comprehension. Okay? So that child might be able to decode sentences perfectly, such as the gorgeous lady with a flowing white robe and golden crown was confined to the attic of the castle. So pwedeng naiintindihan niya yung words na yun. However, if the child does not know the meanings of words such as gorgeous, confined, in attic, or if he or she cannot understand the somewhat complex syntax of sentence, then reading comprehension will also nevertheless be impaired. So remember, listening comprehension and reading comprehension are not equal, but they might inform and they will inform each other. Okay, so I hope you got something out of this talk. So these are some of my references. And yun, maraming salamat. So if you have any questions, you can ask them now. But also, I have my email just in case you want it. I'm in Twitter and Instagram as well. And if you want to follow my YouTube channel, I only have a few subscribers, but I created this for fellow teachers. I'll be uploading materials this year. So now I'm opening the floor for questions. Hi, ma'am.
Thank you very much, sir. Now, it's our question and answer portion. Our first question is from Esmeraldo Dizon. Hi, good afternoon, sir. I find it hard to assess my child because of her developmental delay. She's now in grade 1. What will I do? Should I assess her based on diagnostic for grade 1?
Hello, hi Esmeralda. Hi, Mama Esmeralda. When you say there's a developmental delay, then meaning may specialist na tumingin. Okay? Kasi we cannot just say na may developmental delay kung hindi naman natin siya napa-assess with a specialist or even a doctor, right? So that's a hard question to answer kasi pag may developmental delay na yan, then automatic dapat meron ng plano. Kasi makikita na yan kung anong level yung reading niya, anong level yung listening niya. Okay, but maybe just to answer your question, maybe if you're a teacher, I don't know your context. If you're a parent or a teacher, then you just want to check, then try mo na lang muna yung lower level. Like go first a level down and then check kung kaya na yun. Okay? But again, if the child really has meaning talagang na-diagnose siya with a developmental delay, then you have to work with your team. So yung reading specialist mo, maybe your pedia, your developmental pediatrician, and the like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Our next question is from Annie Rose Zuniega. When it comes to listening and reading connectivity, how can these two skills be applied both on vocabulary skills?
Okay, hi Ma'am Annie. Ma'am Annie, no, tama ba? Yeah. Hello. How? Well, again, they share the same approach. No? Ang difference lang kasi sa reading comprehension, when you're using context clues, you have something that you're reading. So meaning, if you're teaching context clues in reading, you can make them highlight clues, kung ano yung context clues, di ba? Pwede nilang i-highlight yun. If you're reading context clues through listening listening comprehension, then they can list down notes of what they think can be a clue to that. See, you see the difference, right? So they share the same ideas kasi you have five basic types of context clues. You have your synonyms, you have your explanation, yan. So share lang yan ng listening comprehension and ng reading comprehension. But for reading comprehension, you can be more deliberate. Ask them to encircle the words around the target word that will help them unlock that word. For listening comprehension naman, again, like what I said, you can list down ideas. Or even if you can't write yet, then just focus on those ideas. Pwede mo na lang orally itanong, what gave you the idea, what helped you get the idea of what the meaning of the word is. So yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is from Jennifer De La Cruz.
Hi,
What
Jennifer.
kind of assessment tools are fit to use in lower grade to measure or assess their listening skills?
Yeah, like what I showed you, yung assessment tools na ginawa natin kanina, which are informal criterion reference test. If it's in the lower grades, then you can focus first on behavior, like yung listening nila, yung stance nila, di ba? Yung how their eye contact, their the length of the time they can actually sit down and listen, di ba? Pero it doesn't mean na hindi mo pwede nang i-test kasi nagso-storytelling naman tayo, di ba? Even in the early grades. So you can create a very short one, just like 3 4 sentences or 3 sentences, and then you can ask them details on that. Okay, so yung kaninang ginamit, yung pinakita ko sa inyo mga tools that we just created, which are informal diagnostic tools, pwede mo yung gamitin sa lower grades. But don't be limited dun sa, dun sa, dahil lower grades sila, puro behavior lang, o kaya yung eye contact lang itetest mo. No, you can also look at listening comprehension based on stories and storytellings that you read. Ang problem lang talaga, ang challenge lang is you have to make sure that the text is a leveled text. So, if you're not a reading specialist, for example, then you have to at least be familiar dun sa mga text. So what you can do is look at books appropriate for that age level. And tignan mo kung ano yung ano yung sentence structures na ginagawa. Diba? It's very usually subject predicate lang, simple lang yung subject, walang complicated na subjects. Just very straightforward lang yung text. So you can at least approximate lang kung anong text yun. Okay, kasi honestly, meron talagang way to do a level text. Diba? Meron talagang formula yan. But if you don't have access to that yet, then at least familiarize yourself kung ano yung mga nakita mo sa mga reference materials na level para sa Filipino child, ha? Kasi iba yung level talaga ng English for native speakers. So, yeah. Hopefully that answers that.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is from Gleo Tolentino.
Hi,
In
Gleo.
connection with your discussion, how do we handle multilingual learners?
Oh yeah, that's a very very good question. Now, again, I'm a teacher based in Manila, so bilingual lang yung mga students ko. And pag multi-grade ba o multilingual? Sorry po, ano sabi?
Multilingual po.
Multilingual, yeah. For places in the Philippines, marami yan na multilingual. Should actually be very proud of yourselves that you are multilingual. This means that you can, in listening, you can help them by doing a lot of some things like bridging. O kunyari, yung sandwiching method, yung gagawin mo. Kasi it's listening, di ba? You can say the word, the target language in English, translate it quickly in Filipino, and then say it again in English. For example, sa instructions, kaya sa sandwich method. What you can do is, for example, get a piece of paper. Kumuha ng isang papel. Get a piece of paper. So that's a sandwich method, diba? So na tinutulungan nyo sila, kinascaffold nyo silang maintindihan. Yun. So that's how you can develop that. Now, kapag mag-a-assess ka na for that, then pwedeng alisin mo na yung mga translations na ginagawa mo. Okay, so makikita mo kung nakukuha nila o hindi. No? So marami yan. It's really more complicated kapag multilingual, but don't be afraid to refer back to their mother tongue or to their Filipino kung mas comfortable sila doon. Just make sure that it's systematic. Hindi pwedeng translate lang tayo ng translate sa listening comprehension. Meaning you have to expose your children to a lot of listening opportunities or instances in your target language. So pag diagnose mo pa rin siya, dun sa, or assess mo siya dun pa rin sa target language na yun. Pero before you, so makikita mo sa simula na kulang talaga, kunyari. And then all throughout the year, dun mo na gagamitin yung mga sinabi ko strategies. Diba? You can sandwich, you can bridge. Ibig sabihin ng bridge, titignan mo yung similarities ng mother tongue Filipino tsaka English. Diba? Kung kunyari, paano sila nagsa-subject and predicate. Diba? Minsan sa Filipino, nauna yung panaguri sa simulo. Tapos sa English, nauna yung subject sa predicate. So all throughout the year, kasi nakita mo na mahina sila dun sa listening comps ng English mo, tututukan mo yun. I-connect mo yung mga languages na alam na nila and ano yung mga differences na yun. Halimbawa, favorite kong example, yung A, E, I, O, U. Yung A, E, I, O, U, mostly sa mother tongue tsaka sa Filipino, isa lang yung tunog niyan, A, E, I, O, U. Pero sa English, yung A may short A, may long A, may schwa sound, yung E may short E, long E. So all throughout the year, i-expose mo sila dun para mas makita nila yung differences and connection ng language nila, mother tongue, tsaka Filipino, to English. And then, by the end of the year, mag-a-assess ka ulit in that specific language na target mo. And tignan mo kung effective yung instruction. Sorry yun. Habang usapin yan, so ang dami ko nasabi. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you very much, sir. That's all the questions we have for now. Do you have any last reminders for our viewers po for today?
Hello, yes. Okay, again, reading is a technical field. Because meron talaga tayong mga reading specialist, may mga formulas yan, may mga standardized tests talaga yan. But don't be afraid to create your own diagnostic assessment tools na informal. Kasi you are the teacher inside the classroom. We don't always have a reading specialist. We don't always have an expert in our classrooms. We are the experts in that classroom. So I want you to be empowered to create your own assessment and see where your children are at. And at the same time, pag nag-assess ka nga, it should be intentional. Anong gusto mong i-assess? And also use the data. Hindi pwedeng nag-assess ka lang, hindi mo naman gagamitin yung data. And then assess again at the end kung meron talagang pagbabago. And again, just don't be scared. Don't be intimidated when you talk about assessment. You can create your own assessment tools habang wala ka pang expert or wala namang talagang standardized test pa na ibibigay. Okay? Yun lang. And I hope hopefully you enjoyed the discussion and really made it right. I tried to make it really casual and conversation. So, maraming salamat and all the best sa mga magtuturo pa lang this coming school year.
There we have it. In behalf of Vibal Group Incorporated, I would like to thank our speaker for today for this very eye-opening and insightful learning session. It is an honor to have you with us today, sir. And to all our Kavibal viewers, all thanks to you for your continuous patronage to our daily learning session. Don't forget to register to get your e-certificate of participation. We also encourage you to subscribe and watch on our official Vibal Facebook and YouTube channel. Muli, maraming salamat at magandang araw sa ating lahat.
Maraming salamat.